right, guys, ready? Ready? Hello. Okay. Okay. It's not quite the same. Okay. All right, for those who are watching live, please follow along on the slideshow that you got in WhatsApp or that I sent you guys. I can't get the camera to go high enough to focus on the TV, so you're gonna have to look at me for now and follow along on the WhatsApp, the presentation that I sent you. Okay, so you took attendance, attendance. And again, like always, if you're watching live, please let me know so I can keep you in the attendance. Okay, so like I said, this section is kind of longer, and I was hoping to start even earlier, but here we are. Technical difficulties today. We are on section 3, and we've got 2 more after this, and then we'll be done with this module. So we're moving quite well along here. This section is probably the longest, and the next one is a little bit long too, but we'll get through it as fast as possible. So let's start with that. Last time we covered an intro, and then the like who the fathers are, and we did a review on that, and then we did the section on do you remember last time's section? Who were the fathers we talked about? Anybody? What were they called? They were students of the apostles and disciples. They were called the apostolic fathers. It's okay to speak up, okay? So last time we talked about the apostolic fathers. Today we're going to talk about the ante-Nicene fathers, okay? Who are also called the apologetic fathers. And by the way, we have a special guest today with us, if you didn't notice. My son, James. I mentioned him a couple of times in the lectures before because he knows a lot of the stuff because I teach him stuff myself sometimes before I teach it to you guys. So thank you, James, for being my guinea pig at home. So anti, in this case, it's not anti like against. Anti-Nicene or apologetic fathers are people who came before the Council of Nicaea, and apologetic means they are defenders of the faith. Okay, so there is a class of saints and a class of fathers who are called defenders. Okay, and there's a class called confessors, which we'll talk about separately. But these are the defenders. Confessors are people who confess the faith and were almost martyred for their faith. Defenders are people who defended the core of orthodoxy. Most of them are not martyrs. They were just defenders who fought for the faith, who explained the faith. So apologetic means defending or explaining the faith. Whereas the apostolic fathers we talked about last time were establishers of the faith. They basically got the faith started. Apologetic fathers are explaining the faith and defending the faith. So writing an apology means you're writing a defense. The objective of apologetics is to defend that the church was not a danger to the state in which it existed. Remember, we were coming out of Judaism, okay? And Judaism ruled a lot of the land. And after Judaism, there was also, and during the time too, there was idol worship, paganism. And they saw Christianity as anti-Judaism and anti-paganism, and saw it therefore as a danger to the government and to the state. So one of the objectives of the apologetic fathers was to explain that we are not a danger to the state. Okay? They exposed immorality of paganisms. They exposed the immoralities of paganism and defended that Christianity has the correct sorry, I need to ignore that. And exposed and that Christianity has the correct understanding of God and the universe, as well as to defend against the Jews, just like I said. Defended Christianity as offering absolute truth and divine philosophy. They gave a reasoned explanation of Christian doctrine and were more debaters than preachers. Okay? They were more, so apostolic fathers were more preachers. These guys are more debaters because they're debating the efficacy of Christianity, if that makes sense. Okay? So I give you here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would expect you to tell me at least 3 of them on a quiz, for example. Okay? Because this will be sort of like an intro slide to the defenders. It will be important to understand what the objective of an apologetic father is, because apologetic fathers are a core group of fathers that we're going to talk about. So we'll jump right in. First one we're going to talk about, and this is not in any order of importance. This is just in order of whatever was in the book. Okay? Saint Milato of Sardis. He was the bishop of Sardis in Lydia, which is modern-day Turkey, in the 2nd century. He is considered a major light of Asia Minor. He is only one of his books still exists till today, and it's called On the Pascha. Okay. If you don't recognize some of these names, it's because they're not huge figures in the Coptic Church, which would make sense. So if you haven't heard of Saint Milato of Sardis, that's okay. I hadn't heard of him before I went to seminary either. Okay. So it's okay if you haven't heard of him, but here's some highlights of who he is. He is considered an apologetic father. He is the first father to refer to the Hebrew Bible as Old Testament. So this is why some of these things are why we consider them important, because they have highlight things that they do in their, career, life, whatever, that make them stand out as a particular father. Okay? So besides being bishop, which most of them were, he only has one book in existence. Doesn't mean he only wrote one, but that's the one that exists still. And he is the first to refer to the Hebrew Bible as Old Testament. Okay? His theology was that Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and the conception of the divinity and pre-existence of Christ dominates his entire theology. So he's very much somebody who focused on the Old Testament. That's a key thing to remember. Okay? He wrote on Pascha, and he's the first one to name the Old Testament as such. He believed that the function of Christ was to rescue man from sin, death, and the devil. Okay? Justin Martyr, which I think I mentioned to you guys under the Apostolic Fathers, and I said, oh, it's a shame that I don't have any Apostolic Fathers. When I was reviewing this, I realized I put him under apologetic. He can fit both. Okay? He exists sort of in between. Okay? Justin Martyr is one of my favorites. Okay? He's not a martyr. His name is Justin Martyr, but he's not a martyr. Okay? The reason he gets the name martyr is because we were applying this title to people who were staunch defenders of the faith to the point of being almost like a martyr for the sake of the faith. Okay? Justin Martyr fits that bill exactly. He is the most important apologist of the 2nd century. Okay? And I highlighted him a bit last time for you guys under Apostolic Fathers. Okay? But he's the most important apologetic father of the 2nd century. He was born in Syria to heathen parents, to pagan parents. They weren't Christian. He was a student of Socrates and Plato until he converted to Christianity. Okay? So he was a philosopher. This is what's really important about Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr presents us with a father who was a very good crossover between the philosophy of the 2nd century and the Christianity that came to exist in the 2nd century. Okay? He crosses that over very well, and he does an excellent job in all his writings, a lot of which still exist, okay? Where he he uses the philosophy that the people understand at that time to introduce Christianity, okay? This is sort of what we say about the story of the talents, for example. If you have a talent, don't waste it, okay? If you're a good, anything, do that. If you're a good physician, help the poor and help the sick and that kind of thing. If you're rich, give to those. If you have a talent. Justin Martyr had a talent. He was a philosopher, okay? He was a philosopher, a well-educated philosopher, and he became a Christian. So he used his philosophy as a teacher of philosophy to introduce Christianity to those who only understood philosophy. He was a student of Plato and Socrates. These are very, very big names. Even if you don't know anything about anything, you've heard of Plato and Socrates, okay? So he devoted his life to defending Christianity. He focused on defending against the Jews. So the dialogue, there's a really great book called The Dialogue with Trypho, which the first time I read it, I didn't really think it was a dialogue. I was reading it and I was like, what's going on here? It doesn't even introduce itself. It just jumps right in. It almost looks like a script, like a he says, he says, he says, he says. And it's like a script. You're reading a back and forth conversation. The first time I'm reading it, I'm like, what's going on here? Like the book doesn't even jump right, like it just jumps into a conversation. But it's a fantastic book because if you read it, it's like Trypho says, blah, 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 blah. And Justin Martyr says, well, here's your blah, blah, blah. And then here's the blah, 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 blah. And then like he takes what Trypho's saying and like gives something on top of it that makes Christianity more tangible to him. Okay? And so he's the first father to try and reconcile faith and reason. Okay? He's the first one to try to reconcile our faith and the reason. And when we say reason, we're talking about philosophy, okay? Because mankind is philosophical in the way that we develop and the way that we move. Justin Martyr comes in and says, now that I'm a Christian and I understand how humanity works as a philosophy, I'm going to sort of bring Christianity to those who understand philosophy using the philosophy that I understand, which is reason. He is the first to compare St. Mary to Eve, and this becomes a very big thing into the church moving forward. Anybody who's in any service in the church, it's called Mariology or typology, okay? When we compare Mary to such and such things in the Old Testament and so on. He's the first one to compare her to Eve, which is a big comparison, because that's probably the most core comparison we have of St. Mary. It is through Eve that man falls, and it is through Mary that man is saved, because Christ comes through Mary, right? So this the big comparison that is first introduced by Justin Martyr, and I say first because it's like if you've been teaching for a long time, or if you've read, or if you've been studying in anything, you know this is a very simple and known comparison now. We know that Mary and Eve, it's a known comparison. It's like an apple and an apple. You know, an apple. She ate an apple. Okay, so you know this comparison now, right? So, but I highlight it because he's the first one to tell us this, right? Before him, we don't have this. Okay. He is called martyr for his testimony unto death in Rome in 165 A.D. He believed that everyone who can speak the truth and does not speak it shall be judged by God. Okay, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons. He's a disciple of Saint Polycarp. If you remember from last week, we talked about Saint Polycarp. He was one of the apologetic fathers. He was one of the three we talked about last week. Okay, Saint Polycarp, one of the apologetic fathers, who was a student of Saint Peter and Saint Paul. Okay, or was it Saint John? I get them all mixed up, but it's okay. He's one of the students of the disciples. Okay, considered an apologist because his largest work is called an apology. It's an apology, and it's called Against Heresies. Okay, so he speaks greatly against the known heresies of the 1st and 2nd century. He is called the Father of Theology. Big title. Okay, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons. He is called Father of Theology, as his work was transitional in leading to the beginning of understanding the nature of Christ. The nature of Christ. Big topic later on in the church's history. One person, two natures, the nature of Christ. Okay? This becomes a big topic much later on at the Council of Ephesus with St. Cyril. Okay? And an even bigger topic later at Chalcedon when the church splits up. But he's the first one to introduce he's the first one to start talking about it. Remember, I told you in the early centuries, we aren't overly theological. We aren't like overly dug in understanding different things. This is just the beginning of the church. But we call him a father of theology because his work was transitional in leading and understanding the nature of Christ. Meaning, we consider him sort of the bridge between apologists and theologians. Okay? He is considered most important father of the 2nd century. Did I say that about Irenaeus? Sorry. I said most important father of the 2nd century about Justin Martyr. And I'm saying most important father for... You can tell, they're all pretty important, okay? So I won't ask you who's the most important because they're all very important, okay? He is a major opponent of Gnostics with his scientific approach to theology. That's one of the things I like about him. So I'm a scientist by education and by trade. That's what I do for a living. And so when I see fathers who are scientists or who use scientific approaches to Christianity, it always gives me a little bit extra delight because I'm a big believer in the idea that I see God under the microscope, if you've ever heard this from scientists, where when you watch how germs grow and you watch how intricate life is on such a minute detail, you start to believe that it can't be random. This has to be intelligent design, and it becomes a godly thing. So I love when I see scientific fathers and scientific approach. So St. Irenaeus of Lyons, he's a major opponent of the Gnostics. And who are the Gnostics? We talked about them the first week. They were believers in that people with special abilities and special talents, and the higher class were the ones who were going to attain salvation. Special knowledge, right? Like the Mormons. So, but he approaches theology from a scientific perspective and brings it to light. Not nearly as scientific as much later fathers, obviously, but all in perspective with the 2nd century. Continue with St. Irenaeus. He taught that true salvation is attained only through faith in what God has revealed and in what he has done. He was the first great theologian who emphasized the role of the church, the canon of the scripture, and the religious and theological tradition. Again, I highlight because he's the first to kind of bring all the pieces of the tripod of our faith together. What is the Orthodox Church built on? Okay? Scripture, tradition, and canon. Okay? Scripture, tradition, and canon. So, scripture being the Bible, canon meaning dogma and the laws, tradition meaning the things that we've learned from our fathers. Okay? He's the first one to start putting this together, which is really important because it's very early in the church, so tradition is very, if you look back 100 years from today, okay, you're looking at 1922. Okay? That's not that far away. For some of you, that might have been when Grandpa was born or something, or great-grandpa. That's really not that far away. Okay? I was just telling him last night about St. Kirollos Guirguis, who died in 1952. This is not that far away. Okay? So this 100 years is not that far away. And so when we say people in the 2nd century are following traditions of the church, they're only looking back about 100 years or less. Okay? So because about 100 years before he's around, maybe 150 years, is Christ himself on the cross. That's really not that far away. Okay? And so he's the first one to start adding tradition and canon and all that because tradition is barely becoming a thing in the 2nd century. You really don't have tradition if you've only been doing it for 5 or 10 years, right? But if you've been doing something for 70, 80, 100 years, you start to build tradition. So St. Irenaeus is the first one to start incorporating the idea of tradition. He explains Christian doctrine with proof from the Old Testament. Okay, this goes back to St. Milatus of Sardis, who is an Old Testament father. He taught that human thinking is powerless to know God and his dispensation for the salvation of the people. Again, he is fighting against Gnosticism. Gnosticism is talking about knowledge getting you to heaven. He is fighting against this by saying that individual knowledge is not going to take you anywhere. Okay? Can you lower the volume on the phone? Can somebody? Hello? Okay, sure. Believed and taught that no secret tradition supersedes the church's tradition. Okay? Very important. Mormons would hate him today probably because he believed and taught that no secret tradition supersedes the church's tradition. If you think about it, actually, at the beginning of the church, of the Orthodox Catholic Church, we used to close the doors after a certain time and nobody was allowed in for the second part of the liturgy of the catechumens and the liturgy of the word, right? And this was actually the role of the subdeacon. I was supposed to be standing back there closing the door, right? We used to be called the doorkeepers of the church, right? Keep the animals out and be the doorkeepers. We don't do that anymore for a reason. Because we want to get away from the idea that we're doing something in secret. There's nothing secret in the church. No sacrifice is done behind. Like, there is, I think in one of the other Orthodox churches, I can't remember which one, they do the sacrifice, they do the offering with the curtain closed. Okay? I really don't remember which church. But I know one of them does it with the curtain closed. Okay? And it's not, they're one of our sister churches, I don't want to name them out and then be wrong. But they do it with the curtain closed. And we don't do that for a reason because we don't want to give the impression that anything we do is done in secret. Everything is wide open. Do you realize, sorry, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but you realize at the very end of the liturgy, okay, when Abuna says, peace be with you all, and he turns like this and he bows, he's actually not looking at us and bowing to us. He doesn't give a blessing anymore. He turns and he does this in front of the altar. And the reason is he's showing you the body one more time. Right? He's like, I haven't changed anything. It's still right here. This is still the body. Y'all can take the blessing now. And then communion is about to start. That very last part, when Abuna is bowing down, he's not bowing down to us. He's not giving us a blessing. He's not bowing down to the deacon next to him. He's showing us the body. Nothing is in secret. It hasn't changed. It's still right there. Okay? Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. But anyway, so no secret knowledge. Now, Tertullian. One of the more interesting ones. Okay? There's only 2 saints that we're going to talk about who are fathers, but not saints. It's important. Fathers, but not saints. Tertullian is one of them. Origen is the other. Okay, but Tertullian lived between 155 and 222, so 1st, 2nd century. He was a renowned lawyer. That's not the reason why he's not a saint, but he was a renowned lawyer before converting to Christianity, after being inspired by martyrs. Okay, he sees the martyrs dying in the 1st and 2nd century. He's convinced that people who are dying for their faith must be correct. Okay, so Tertullian is inspired by this and becomes a Christian. But he had some problems. He was brash, bold, and confrontational. That's for one. His expression is bold, concise, rugged, involved, and he does not bother with beauty of form. Meaning this guy is just, look, you sin, you go to hell. That's it. I mean, there's no negotiating this, right? You're bad, you're gone. See ya. Okay? He's just a very tough speaker. And he's very harsh in the way that he spoke. He's very aggressive in the way that he writes. He's a lawyer, okay? His expression, he had very little patience for those he believed to be stubborn pagans and fools. Okay? His faith is, it is to be believed because it is absurd. Actually, I like that saying myself. I like it because when we describe Christianity, we say it is to be believed because it is absurd. It is absurd to believe that somebody dies on the cross and actually rises from the dead. It is absurd. If you took it purely scientifically, it would be absurd. It is to be believed because it is absurd. Absurd. Okay? Tertullian. With Blessed Augustine, he is the greatest of Western theologians. You may not have heard of Tertullian. You may have. Okay? He plays a role in our faith too. But along with St. Augustine, who you definitely heard of, St. Augustine and St. Monica, right? We've all heard of St. Augustine, I hope. Okay? Along with St. Augustine, he is considered one of the greatest Western theologians. Another thing about St. Augustine, by the way, he almost was also not a saint. Almost. But when we get to Augustine later, I'll tell you why. In a sense, he created the clear language of Western theology. He's kind of a big deal in the Catholic Church, just like Augustine is. Augustine is much bigger in the Catholic Church than here. I don't think we have any churches no, I'm sure we do, but I don't know many churches named after Augustine, while in the Catholic Church, they definitely name a lot of things after Augustine. Okay? Excuse me. Okay, so along with Augustine, he is considered one of the greatest Western theologians. And he is one of the key influencers, key word for today, right? An influencer without Instagram. He's an influencer in the development of Western theology, okay? He is the most productive of all Latin writers and most original and personal. He's also one of the harshest, if not the harshest. His writings are apologetic, try to understand this one, dogmatico-polemic, okay? Which means defending dogma, okay? Dogmatico-polemic. I won't ask you for that. And practico-ascetical, which means they are ascetical in practice, meaning, so when we read St. Anthony, for example, and he talks about, like, when we read the life of St. Anthony, which is written by St. Athanasius, obviously, if you didn't know, St. Anthony speaks of a very ascetic life in the desert, whereas Tertullian speaks of asceticism also, but a little bit more in practical, everyday living. So practico-ascetical, okay? His chief work was called Against Marcion, and in 5 books written over a period of about 12 years. Marcion is a heretic who believed that Jesus was the Savior who was sent by God, and that St. Paul was his chief apostle. He rejected all Christian teachings. So this was a heresy that barely clung on to Christianity, okay? And Tertullian obviously fought against it. Now, here's a slide that tells you why he's not a saint, okay? He was very impatient with Christians, and in the year 205 or 207, he became a Montanist and attacked Christianity violently. A Montanist was, they were like, sort of like, what's the best word to put this? Sort of like terrorist Christians, okay? They were like the really, almost like today's, what do you call those guys that started the U.S. and not the ones who, Pilgrims, right? Who were like right is right, wrong is wrong, and there's no gray line. They were very strict Christians. Okay, you think we're strict? You should see these matnas. They were like, you die, you know? Okay? But it gets even better. When he had died, he actually had left the Montanus and he thought they were too weak. Okay? And he created his own sect, and its members were known as Tertullianists. Okay? So even the stringiest and the most stubborn of all Christians, he thought they were too weak. I don't know what was going through Tertullian's head. Okay? But he just really couldn't stand any shade of any kind of gray when it came to the faith. Okay? He cannot be considered a saint by the church, but many of his works are considered orthodox in their content and too valuable to lose. Remember, he dies in 222, and really his nuttiness doesn't start until about 205, 207. So there's a good 15 years at the end of his life where he's kind of on the nutty side when it comes to hyperdox faith. Okay? But before that, there's a lot of stuff that's very valuable for us from him. So we rely on him as a church father, but we don't call him a saint. Okay? Here comes one with a really cool name, Hippolytus. Okay? Saint Hippolytus of Rome. Again, you'll notice a trend. Milato of Sardis, Irenaeus of Lyons. A lot of these are Western fathers so far. A lot of apologetics happens in the West in the beginning. Okay? Don't ask me why, because I really don't know. But a lot of the apologetics happens with Western fathers. We're going to get to a couple of non-Western fathers in just a minute. Like Origen was super not Western father. He was very much one of us. Okay? But a lot of these fathers are Western. He is a Greek-speaking priest in Rome in the late 2nd century. He's also mentioned in our Synaxarium. There is an entry for Hippolytus. And there's actually an entry for Hippolytus and another entry for the founding of his body. So he is a well-documented saint in our church. He resembled Irenaeus in theology, again, both Western, and he was his student, actually. Origen in scholarship, you haven't heard about Origen yet, but I'll tell you, Origen was, there's a saying about Origen that if he wasn't reading, he was dead. He was reading when he was eating, he was reading when he was sleeping, he was reading when he was bathing, Origen was a scholar of scholars. We call Origen the father of fathers, okay? So when we say he resembled Origen in scholarship, we're saying that he was well-read and well-educated. Tertullian in attitude, which means he was very harsh, okay? But was inferior to all three in originality and achievement, meaning he was sort of like a little bit of each of them, but he did not match up to their superiority in any of these categories. It's not to say he was less than anything, he just wasn't as accomplished as them. He is best known today for his liturgical manual, the Apostolic Tradition, whose central prayer is used until today in the Roman Catholic liturgy or Mass. Okay? Do you know, by the way, why we call it Mass over there and liturgy over here? Any idea? Because liturgy is the work of the people, Mass is the work of the priest. Okay? We have a liturgy that is the work of the people. Okay? Just a side note. Most important work is the Philosophomena, okay, which is the refutation of all heresies. Say Philosophomena 10 times fast. But it just means refutation of all heresies, okay? Which finds the origin of Christian heresies in the philosophical school of the Greeks. Similar, again, to Justin Martyr, who used philosophy. A lot of these guys are alive around the same time, doing very similar things, okay? Hippolytus is not without controversy. He had quite a bit of controversy. Okay, he's still considered a saint though. Hippolytus and some of his followers separated from the church. Okay, so much like Tertullian, but Tertullian went and started his own religion towards the end. You have work, right? Yeah, that's okay. You can watch the live after. Okay, yeah. So Hippolytus and some of his followers separated from the church. And he was elected Bishop of Rome by a small but influential circle, and thus became the first, that's probably an important term to remember, the first anti-pope. And in this case, anti meaning opposite. A-N-T-I versus A-N-T-E. Okay? Anti-pope. Anti-pope is because he was bishop or pope in direct opposition to the real bishop or pope of the time. Okay? We got that? Because I'm probably going to ask who was the first anti-pope. That seems like a reasonable question. He's exiled to the island of Sardinia in 235 with St. Pontian. He clashed with Celestius, which was he was the actual bishop of Rome. So he's, the actual bishop in line in Rome. He clashed with him on Christology, which is the study of Christ, and the nature of the church and forgiveness. So they didn't agree on this. Remember, he was sort of like Tertullian when it came to forgiveness. He didn't want to give it away. Okay? Hippolytus wanted a church of the pure and took a rigorous position against forgiving those guilty of serious sins after receiving baptism. Imagine if we were still like him and Tertullian today, and we said, after you're baptized, you can't have any more serious sins. We'd all be kind of lost. Okay? Especially because we all get baptized very, very little, obviously. So you can't sin your entire life. Well, that's not how Christ even envisioned humanity. Okay? And so he wanted a church of the pure. And that's already something wrong if you say it out loud. A church of the pure? That doesn't make any sense. Right? Is there ever a hospital where there's no sick people? Okay? You don't go to a pharmacy, besides maybe getting, I don't know, pharmacies sell everything today. But medicine, okay? You can walk in the pharmacy and get a DVD if you want. If you still watch DVDs. But the point is, it's a place where you are sick, okay? Before they were killed, though, and this is the reason why he's considered a saint, him and St. Pontian made up with the Pope. They kind of reconciled with the Pope for Bishop Fabian, and Bishop Fabian brought the two bodies back to Rome and buried them with honor by the church on the same day. So the way they were buried in the end is what tells us that they made up with the church, okay? And so we still consider him a saint, okay? He's a little bit questionable because, he had obviously some controversies, but he's even in Ars Nixar, and he's considered, yes, he was anti-pope, yes, he, was too tough on the people and all that, but in the end, he made up with the church and was able to rejoin at some point in his life, and he's buried in a proper Catholic or proper Christian burial. If he hadn't been, he would have died in exile. Okay. Saint Cyprian of Carthage. Okay. I don't know if I corrected the slideshow. I forgot to look at this, but not the same Cyprian as Cyprianus here. Okay? I, for the longest time, thought he was. So if I didn't correct the slideshow, I'm sorry, but he's not the same Cyprian as the one for St. Justina. St. Justina Cyprian is also Cyprian of Carthage, and that's what makes it confusing. But this was a bishop, and Cyprian of Carthage for St. Justina was a priest. Okay? So, it's confusing, I understand, but just bear with me, okay? He lived in a time when Christians strongly sided with the idea that if you lapsed and denied Christ during persecution, that you were to never be welcomed back into the church. So, remember, around this time, there's a great deal of persecution in the church. People are often falling into... We always hear about the saints who stand up to the bad emperor and who say, cut my neck off, I'd rather die as a Christian. Okay? That's the stories we hear. Okay? But for every one of those saints, there were hundreds who said, fine, I'm going to be whatever you want me to be. Okay? Sadly, but that's what happened. So around the time of St. Cyprian, there are a lot of people who we call them lapsed Christians. Lapsed meaning they fell into heresy or paganism or whatever in order to avoid being killed. This happens till today, unfortunately, where some Christians will lapse into, let's say, Islam, okay, so that they are not, second-class citizens in their country. It happened during ISIS invasion in Iraq. Lots of people died for being Christians. Lots, and they're all considered martyrs. But there are several others who said, here, take my tax money and leave me alone. Or, okay, I'll be Muslim, it's okay. It happens. ISIS is out of Iraq now, thank God. And these Christians are now, the Syrian church is back in Iraq and opening its doors again for the most part. Some of these Christians who survived are facing this very dilemma that St. Cyprian faced in the 2nd century. But he already established for us what to do. So it's not like Ephraim the Syrian, I'm sorry, as Ephraim, the one that we mentioned in the liturgy, has to make a decision all over again right now. No, Saint Cyprian already made the decision for him and told him what to do from now. Why? Because despite sharing much of Tertullian's theology, Saint Cyprian actually stood strongly on the side of those repenting after lapsing. So whereas Tertullian would have been like, nope, you fell into paganism, you go to hell. Saint Cyprian said, if you are repentant and want to come back to the church, we will welcome you. Now, do you think everybody loved him for that? Quite the opposite, actually. There was quite a big section of the church that said, dude, we almost died, and these guys lapsed. How could you treat them the same? Right? And we all know the story of the prodigal son, right? His dad didn't say, dude, your brother stood around and helped me out here. You were gone for this time. Sorry, buddy. Go back to where you were. No. Christ already established for us the idea that even if you've lapsed as badly as the prodigal son, you are welcomed back into your father's home. And so St. Cyprian does the same. But he is not well loved for it. I'm sure those who came back to the church loved them, but those who were like, dude, we almost died, were like, dude, that's not cool, right? So and that exact language is very theological language. Dude, that's not cool, okay? So we got not enough people to laugh. It's okay. Despite sharing, so during a massive persecution by Decius, okay, St. Cyprian chose to flee to escape death with hopes to return to shepherd his flock. That's one of the reasons why they didn't like him. They thought that he escaped this whole persecution, and so he himself was weak. But he didn't escape. He literally did what many other fathers will do later, like Pope Benjamin later on. You need something, Drew? Okay. What Pope Benjamin does later on, where he goes into hiding so that he can continue to be the shepherd of the church. It's perfectly acceptable. Okay? When he returned, he found a deeply divided church in need of healing. He set out and wrote many volumes of books in hopes of restoring unity in his flock, which did work, but it was a struggle. In his writings, he did not indulge in speculation, but concerned himself with the needs of the hour, with practical aims and interests, appeals to Christian sentiment and to Scripture. So he knew that he was entering a very divided church and didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about theology and Christ's nature and the Trinity and all this stuff. He just wanted to heal the church. Okay? Actually, much the same can be said about Pope Kirollos VI, for example. He doesn't spend a lot of time digging into theology and Trinity and all this. He knows that when Pope Kirollos took over the church, it was a very divided church. There was a period of time when we had no pope. There was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of even fighting between the bishops, a lot of accusations. So when Pope Kirollos takes over, he takes over with the mindset that this is a time to heal the church. Pope Shenouda comes into a much better, more healed church, and we get one of the greatest theologians of our modern times. You see, when the church is broken, we get people who are healing the church, right? When the church needs theologians, we are given theologians like Pope Shenouda, right? Pope Tewodros is sort of in between. He does a little bit of both. He believes that love is everything, and at the same time, he's very well theologically in tune and writes a lot of things for us in theology as well. God chooses the right shepherd for the right time. Okay, so he wrote many writings. 13 of them still exist, called the treaties. You don't need the Arabic word, but treaties are sort of just what I described. They're meant to unify. They're meant to unify. He taught that he can no longer, not him himself, there should be quotes on this. He can no longer have God for his father who has not the church for his mother. And I've always been an advocate of putting that on the door of every church. Okay? Because you can no longer have God for your father if the church is not your mother. As you enter the church, you should know this. That God cannot be your father if the church is not your mother. Okay? This is why we come to church. There are some who believe he is the same. I corrected myself. There are some who believe that he is the same St. Cyprian from the story of St. Justina. He's not. he was ultimately martyred in 258 during the Valerian persecution. So although he escapes martyrdom for quite a bit of time, and he escapes persecution for a long time, and he fights for returning those who lapsed in time, he does end up nonetheless being a martyr. Okay? Okay, St. Clement of Alexandria. Alexandria, because there's also a Clement of Rome. Okay? Both important, both considered fathers in the church, they both come at very different times. Okay? Clement of Alexandria lived from 150 to 215 and is considered a major, and by the way, I will never ask you about the years that they were alive, that's just too specific, but you might just generally want to know that they were 1st, 2nd, 3rd century fathers, okay? Which is a good guess because we said the golden age of Patristics is 4th to 6th century, we can maybe say 3rd to 6th century, okay? During his time, Gnostics were growing in popularity and took ownership of the word knowledge, leading to it being negative in the church. So, sort of like how the Catholic Church overexalted St. Peter and made him the first. Before they did this, St. Peter was one of the highest considered apostles or disciples in all the churches. After this, there's this trend in the Orthodox Church to kind of downplay Peter a little bit. Just a little bit. Because the Catholic Church really exalted him. And so we tend to, there's this sort of like from the 1800s on, maybe 1700s on, there's this trend in the church to try and downplay the role of Peter in the church, only because they overexalted him in the Western side, okay? This sort of happens here with St. Clement of Alexandria. The word knowledge gets owned by Gnostics. And so we try to downplay the word knowledge in the church, because like, we don't mean knowledge like a secret thing, because the Gnostics have started to own it. But he comes in to correct this, okay? He wanted to retake the word knowledge from the Gnostics. He wanted to say, no, knowledge is not a bad thing. But when you say knowledge is the only thing that gets you to heaven, that is a bad thing. And so he starts to retake the word knowledge. Now, unlike Tertullian, St. Clement of Alexandria wanted to change this and worked to reclaim the concept of knowledge. So Tertullian was like, you all can have the knowledge, we're going to have something else, okay? Unlike Tertullian, he wanted to take ownership of the word knowledge. He saw secular philosophy as a tool to express true knowledge when used correctly. So again, another father who takes philosophy, and by the way, now we're not in the Western fathers anymore. Alexandria is obviously the East. He wrote, God is love, and he is knowable to those who love him. God is love, and he is knowable to those who love him. He traveled extensively, seeking instruction from famous Christian teachers. He settled in Alexandria, ordained a priest, and became, and underlined, bolded, he became the first dean of the School of Theology. Okay, Clement of Alexandria. I've heard people who hear me say this and then argue that St. Mark was the first one and that there were others who, but when I say he's the first dean of the School of Theology, the School of Theology once established, because prior to him, it's just a place where people are kind of coming and going, right? They're learning things, they come and go. And St. Mark, maybe established something there, but an established institution, okay, he's the first dean of that school. He's also the first Christian writer to confront the ideas of the time with Christian doctrine. So he fought Gnostics using Christianity. His ancient philosophy, in his view, was unable to achieve more than a glimpse of the truth, while Christianity offers the perfect knowledge and truth in Christ. He taught supremacy of Christian gnosis, knowledge, and his main work is called The Trilogy, an outline of the theological system. Now, I hate that I always leave Origen as the last one in this section. He is the last father we're talking about today. The reason is I can do a lecture, I can do a series on Origen alone, okay? But we're going to relegate everything about him into 3 slides. I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes on Origen alone, and you'll understand why when I'm done. Give me a second, I got to drink some water. Very, very important. So, We've talked about several fathers so far. Sardis, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Clement, Cyprian, lots of ante-Nicene fathers, apologetic fathers. Few, if any, will compare to Origen, even though he's not a saint. So Origen is born to Christian parents. Father was martyred. His dad was a martyr. Origen rented libraries overnight to read their books. This guy was a sponge of books. He was a living library. He rented libraries to read their books at night. Origen read while eating, walking, resting, etc. I think I made that earlier comment. He is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest mind of the church, in the church. Pope Demetrius made him the second dean of the School of Alexandria after Clement. Okay? He became the teacher of teachers. The halls he rented were never large enough to keep the people that he was teaching. There were more people than any space he could afford to get. He was chased away by heretics in every location. They couldn't stand him. He was such a smart, educated, and intelligent father that the heretics literally chased him away instead of arguing with him. He began teaching openly in public by the rivers. He couldn't get enough, the spaces he would get for people were not big enough, so he just started standing up in public, and people would just fill up fields. I always wondered, without mics, how they spoke to get people's attention. I mean, the numbers that we hear about with him teaching, you're talking about when Christ is speaking to 5,000 men today, right, in the gospel, like, how did he speak so? It's Christ, but, I mean, how do you get this voice out to 5,000 people? I don't know, but at least we can say it was Christ. He was and is famous for his allegorical interpretations. If you were here for presentation number 1, you heard about the allegorical types of speaking. You speak in analogy, basically. And Origen is full of analogies. My goodness, the man, you read one of his books, I read a couple of his books, analogy after analogy, and as this is this, and as that is to that, as this is this, and as Christ is this, and it's all allegory. You can easily get lost. And also easily misinterpret, which happens a lot with Origen, as you'll see. He is believed to have written over 6,000 manuscripts. So if he wasn't reading, he was writing. And if he wasn't writing, he was reading what he wrote. He read a lot of things, he wrote a lot of things. Okay? His writings are mainly, besides allegorical, intellectual. Now we get to some of the issues of Origen. I can't tell you how many times I've copied and pasted the next 2 slides to answer questions online of people who say, what was wrong with Origen? And I copy and paste these 2 slides for them so many times. Okay? So, Pope Demetrius held 2 councils. Pope Demetrius, he's called Demetrius the Vine Dresser. He's the 12th Pope. Okay? He was the Pope that was married, but was celibate with his wife. Okay? Important Pope in the Church's history. He's the last patriarch to not be called Pope. After him, the 13th person on became called Pope because it was assigned to us to have that title. Alexandria is the only place where you're supposed to be called Pope. All the others are supposed to be called Patriarch or Bishop. So Rome is actually kind of stealing the term illegally. But, you know, we don't have any lawyers in the church or anything. Plenty of lawyers, but not those kinds of lawyers. So Pope Demetrius held 2 councils in 231 that actually excommunicated Origen due to his theological mistakes, which is the next slide I'm going to give you. There are a couple, I think there's 7, and I'm going to expect you to memorize as many of them as possible because they're all very important to know why he made mistakes. Because for as great as Origen was, as much as I personally greatly love Origen, he's not a saint because he made a lot of mistakes. The other reason he was excommunicated, and it's very important to know, is that he accepted priesthood in Palestine, though he was ineligible due to self-castration. Self-castration. He cut off his own private parts. Okay? That's self-castration. A person cannot be a priest if he has a major deformity like this, okay? Self-inflicted. So if I go out and do what Saint Simon the Tanner did and say, I'm going to pluck out my own eye so that I don't feel temptation, I am not eligible to be a priest, okay? Origen did the same thing. He's like, I'm going to cut off my private parts so I don't have any temptation. And he's not eligible to be a priest. But he took priesthood in Palestine nonetheless. Okay? That's what he did. Don't think about it too much. After death of Pope Demetrius, Origen tried to return to Alexandria, and his excommunication was upheld by Pope Heraclius. And Heraclius is the first one that is rightfully called Pope, but that's a different story. This is a very similar story that happens with Arius, for example. When Arius is excommunicated by St. Peter, the seal of the martyrs, he tries to come back when St. Peter is in prison, right? So, hey, you're about to die. Why don't you lift my excommunication? And I don't know if you've heard the story of St. Peter, seal of the martyrs, but he has a vision in prison of Christ wearing a robe that is torn in half. And he tells him, it's because Arius has separated me from my father, never accept him back into the church. So St. Peter says, not going to take you back, buddy. Okay? Arius, as James would like to tell you, was such a major jerk because he goes to complain to the governor. He literally says he's a major jerk. And he says, because he goes to the governor, complains, and the governor sends a bunch of soldiers who kill thousands of Christians on account of Arius' complaint. Yeah, he was a jerk. Okay? He's also a heretic, which is worst. Okay? So in this case, Origen comes back to Alexandria and goes to Heraclius. And why does he go to Heraclius specifically? Okay? Besides the fact that he's the Pope. Heraclius was his student. Imagine, God forbid, I get excommunicated and you become Pope and I come to you and be like, hey, remember when I was your teacher? Can you take me back now? Like, no. Okay? That's what he did. So he went to Heraclius and he said, hey, remember when I gave you that A in class, you know? I'm just kidding. But he said, I think it's time for me to come back to the church. And Heraclius says, you know, as much as you're my teacher and you're my master and all this, there's a reason why we excommunicated you. And so we're going to uphold that excommunication. And props to Heraclius because he did the right thing in that case. Okay? Now he spent the rest of his life in Palestine where he established a significant theological school. Okay? And then there was a later council in Alexandria in the year 400. This is like 2 centuries later. Okay, much, much later. And it officially condemned Origenism. And Pope Theophilus expelled that's a different story. I don't want you to get lost in the weeds. Okay? This is the last slide, and I'm right on time. Okay? Here are the 6 mistakes of Origen. They're called Origenisms. I have exactly 5 minutes, and I'm going to say it. Essentially, so the first one is subordination. Essentially saying that the Father is greater than the Son, which gives hierarchy in the unity. This is a big problem because much like Arius, where we separate them, he's actually sort of inadvertently separating them. Okay? He called the Logos created. We together, guys? Good? Sandy, right? Yeah, cool. This is the last slide. You have to go? Okay, all right. So he called the Logos created. I need to start with Origen next time. He's so important, and I leave him till the very end. This happens every time. Okay, he called the Logos created. The Son came to exist at the will of the Father. This is a quote from him. The Son is a created being. This sounds a whole lot like Huju? The Son is a created being? Arius, you're right. It sounds a lot like Arius, okay? Not saying that Origen was Arian, that'd be a terrible thing to say, but what I am saying is Arius builds a lot of his heresy on the misinterpretation of Origen. Okay? His exaggerations in his allegorical interpretation also cause a lot of problems. He believes in something called ultimate salvation or restoration of demons, and this one he stuck with until the end. This one was something that he wasn't willing to give up. He believed and he taught that even the demons would be given a chance at salvation at judgment, meaning even the devil could still be saved. Big problem, and he stuck with it, and it was a big problem. He also believed in something called the pre-existence of souls. He taught that souls were created, then sent to be united with bodies. This is where a lot of Jehovah's Witness build their heresy from. As you'll see, as great of a teacher as Origen was, he also became sort of the inadvertent teacher of heresies too, because of his open way of talking and his allegorical way of talking, and a lot of his misinterpretations were taken into further misinterpretations and made into greater heresies that will divide the church later. His final mistake was something called reincarnation, which he believed in sort of like the recycling of souls. Okay? All of these are greatly misunderstood about Origen. He didn't mean any of them, except maybe the one about ultimate salvation. It's hard to fight that one in the way he writes, okay? But a lot of this stuff, if not all of it, is really misunderstood about Origen. And that's a terrible thing, because Origen is a tremendous teacher, magnificently important teacher, okay? He is the father of fathers, the teacher of teachers, we give a lot of these titles to Pope Shenouda too, but he's the father of fathers, teacher of teachers, Pope before the popes. Like, he was the guy, okay? But when you're that great, when you read as much as he did, when you write as much as you did, and all this, you're also bound to have some mistakes. And he did have mistakes. And as much as I'm a defender of Origen being recognized even more than he is, I also accept that he has a lot of mistakes, most of which are just misunderstood. But as far as our academic learning, we have to know that these were his mistakes. We can argue till kingdom come about whether they are meant or not, whether they are true or not, whether they are misunderstood, misinterpreted, whatever. But those are his mistakes, and from them, many future heresies will come. That's why Origen is not a saint. Okay? With that, we conclude. And I know it was long, but I told you it was going to be long. Next week will be sort of long as well, but a little shorter than this. Okay? From the four that are here, any questions? Anybody who has any questions who's watching live, you can feel free to forward them to me in WhatsApp, and I'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. Okay? Thank you, guys. Let's do a quick prayer, and we conclude. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for bringing us here together again today to learn more about our great church fathers, those who are defenders of the faith and apologists. Help us be like them in defending and understanding our faith. And hear us through the interest of the Holy Virgin Mary and our intercessors, St. Justina, St. George, and St. Guirguis, when we say all thanksgiving, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Partake us, O Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, thank you guys for coming and sticking it out. And not so far. Maybe I'll check. Austin. Hey, I was in. I loved it. It was a great lesson. I'll keep tucking notes down.